At 9:17 a.m. on January 22, 1943, the jungle west of Point Cruz was already awake. Birds screamed. Insects never stopped. Somewhere beyond the trees, artillery thudded like distant weather. None of it mattered. Second Lieutenant John George lay motionless inside the shattered remains of a Japanese bunker, his body pressed into damp earth, his rifle angled through a collapsed firing slit. He was alone. No spotter. No radio. 60 rounds of ammunition. 1 canteen. And a rifle every officer in his battalion had laughed at. 240 yards away, a banyan tree rose 87 feet into the canopy. 14 American soldiers had been killed in this grove in 72 hours. Shot while filling canteens. Shot while walking trails they had cleared the day before. Shot from trees they never saw. 11 Japanese snipers were operating somewhere out there, invisible, patient, trained to let the jungle swallow them whole. George had been told to leave his rifle in the tent. A civilian rifle. Bolt action. 5 rounds. A mail-order scope meant for deer, not war. The army issued Garins for a reason. Semi-automatic. 8 rounds. Real weapons for real soldiers. George ignored the order. Through the low magnification of his scope, the jungle was a wall of green and shadow. Trunks blended into vines. Branches layered over branches. The eye lied constantly. The jungle punished impatience. At exactly 9:17, something moved. Not a man. Not a shape. Just a branch where there should have been none. No wind. No bird. A shift so small it would disappear if he blinked. 87 feet up. George slowed his breathing. The rifle's weight settled into his shoulder. He adjusted 2 clicks for wind. If he was wrong, he would not get a second chance. A missed shot would echo through the trees, and the jungle would answer with bullets. Somewhere nearby, a second sniper would already be watching. Japanese snipers never worked alone. George squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked. A single sharp sound, swallowed almost instantly by the canopy. For half a second, nothing happened. Then a body tore free from the branches and fell through the leaves, hitting the ground with a sound that no one in the grove would mistake for anything else. George worked the bolt and stayed on the scope. If the jungle had noticed him, it would respond soon. And by every rule of modern warfare, this was the moment where he should have died. Why, according to every doctrine that existed in 1943, should this have been impossible? By January 1943, the jungle around Point Cruz had already defeated everyone who tried to solve it the correct way. American doctrine was clear. Infantry moved in formations. Firepower suppressed threats. Speed and aggression denied the enemy time to react. It was a system designed for fields, hedgerows, roads. It worked in places where you could see what was killing you. The jungle offered none of that. West of the Matanicaw River, there were no fixed Japanese positions. No trenches to overrun. No bunkers to destroy. Just trees. Massive banyan trees, some rising 90 feet high, their branches spreading outward like a second roof above the jungle floor. A man could climb one before dawn and disappear for an entire day. No footprints. No muzzle flash visible through the leaves. No sound direction you could trust. The Japanese had adapted to this environment long before the Americans arrived. Their snipers did not hunt like marksmen on a range. They waited. They let malaria weaken units. They studied trails, water points, supply routes. Then they fired once, relocated, and vanished. In 72 hours, 14 Americans from the 132nd Infantry Regiment were killed this way. Not in attacks. Not in firefights. One at a time. A man filling his canteen. A patrol walking ground they had already cleared. A soldier shot through the neck from a tree his unit had passed twice without seeing anything wrong. There were 11 Japanese snipers operating in the Point Cruz groves. Standard response called for patrols. More men. Aggressive movement to flush the shooters out. That response had already failed. Every additional patrol created more targets. Every attempt to move fast through the jungle multiplied blind angles. The jungle did not reward initiative. It punished it. American weapons doctrine did not help either. The M1 Garand was the pride of the infantry. Semi-automatic. 8 rounds. Fast follow-up shots. It was designed to dominate firefights through volume and speed. In the jungle, that advantage evaporated. You could not see far enough to use rate of fire. You rarely saw your enemy at all. Sniper doctrine, as a formal concept, barely existed. The army had no standardized sniper program. No issued sniper rifles. No tables of organization that accounted for men whose job was to wait, observe, and fire a single shot. Optics were rare, heavy, and fragile. Civilian scopes were viewed as liabilities, not force multipliers. The jungle reinforced that belief. Moisture ruined equipment. Heat warped wood. Mold attacked lenses. Anything delicate was expected to fail. Against that backdrop, the idea of solving the Point Cruz problem with one man and one rifle bordered on negligence. A lone shooter had no security. No one to watch his flanks. No one to warn him if he was being stalked. If he fired and missed, the sound alone could mark his death. Japanese snipers worked in pairs for a reason. One shooter. One observer. The observer existed to kill anyone who revealed themselves. Even if the lone man was perfect, the math did not favor him. 11 enemy snipers. Unknown positions. Unlimited time. The jungle as concealment. Every hour spent watching increased the chance of being detected. Every shot fired increased the chance of retaliation. And the enemy had mortars. Machine guns. Infantry units nearby who could respond once a position was identified. Under normal logic, the correct answer was patience at the battalion level. Wait it out. Accept losses. Move operations elsewhere. The jungle would eventually starve the snipers of targets. That logic cost lives. What made the mission impossible was not just the enemy. It was the environment, the doctrine, and the assumptions baked into both. The jungle erased visibility. Doctrine erased flexibility. And the rifle John George carried violated every accepted rule at the same time. It was bolt action. 5 rounds. Slow by modern standards. It required deliberate movement to cycle the bolt, breaking sight picture after every shot. Its scope offered only modest magnification. Enough to see movement, not enough to dominate a wide field of view. It was also accurate in a way most issued weapons were not. It rewarded patience instead of speed. It punished rushed shots. It demanded that the shooter see something real before pulling the trigger. The problem was that accuracy alone did not solve the jungle. To succeed, one man would need to outweight professional hunters who had already proven they could kill without being seen. He would need to read movement where others saw nothing. He would need to fire without revealing himself long enough to be countered. And he would need to do it repeatedly, knowing that every success narrowed the enemy's focus onto him. By doctrine, by numbers, and by terrain, this was not a mission that produced victories. It produced casualties. Which was why no one sane would volunteer to do it. And why, when John George lay in that bunker on the morning of January 22, the rifle in his hands represented more than a tool. It represented a rejection of every safe answer the system had left. John George did not look like the kind of man the jungle respected. He was 27 years old. Not a veteran of the early island campaigns. Not a Marine hardened by months of attrition. He had no confirmed kills. No reputation forged in combat. Just a record on paper that meant very little once the trees closed in. Before the war, he had been a competitive shooter. Illinois state champion. Precision at distances most soldiers never trained for. Targets that stayed still. Wind you could read. A clean sight picture. None of that impressed infantry officers who measured competence by marches completed and assaults survived. When George unpacked his rifle at Camp Forest in Tennessee, the reaction had been immediate and dismissive. A sporting rifle. Bolt action. Scope mounted on top like something borrowed from a hunting magazine. The armorer asked if it was meant for deer or Germans. Someone else joked that it belonged on a farm, not a battlefield. George did not argue. He had already learned that explanations rarely changed opinions. The rifle did not even deploy with him. While other men cleaned their issued garrons during the voyage to the Pacific, George watched empty-handed. His weapon sat in a warehouse in Illinois, delayed by paperwork and indifference. He spent weeks knowing that if he reached combat before it arrived, his credentials would mean nothing. When the crate finally showed up in late December, marked fragile, it felt less like reinforcement and more like a test. By then, his battalion had already fought on Mount Austin. 16 days of brutal uphill fighting against bunkers and entrenched defenders. Dozens killed. Hundreds wounded. George's rifle stayed slung, unused. He followed orders. He carried what he was told to carry. He survived without proving anything. That silence worked against him. In an army that valued shared hardship, unused skill looked suspicious. Other platoon leaders trusted what they knew. The garand was known. It was standardized. It fit the doctrine. George's rifle did not. Captain Morris made it clear. Leave the sporting rifle behind. Carry a real weapon. George carried it anyway. Not out of arrogance. Out of calculation. He understood what his rifle could do. He also understood what it could not. 5 rounds meant every decision mattered. Cycling the bolt meant losing sight picture. If he missed, the jungle would answer before he could recover. That knowledge did not comfort him. It weighed on him. When the battalion commander summoned him on the night of January 21st, it was not a vote of confidence. It was desperation. 14 men dead in 3 days. Patrols failing. Morale cracking. The snipers were killing faster than malaria. The commander did not ask if George wanted the job. He asked if the rifle worked. George listed his credentials because that was all he had. Championships. Group sizes. Distances. Numbers that sounded impressive in a classroom and hollow in the jungle. When he finished, the commander gave him until morning. It was not encouragement. It was a deadline. That night, George cleaned his rifle again. Cosmoline still clung to the metal from its ocean voyage. He checked the mounts. Retightened screws. Ran patches through the barrel until they came out clean. He handled the ammunition he had brought from Tennessee, the same cartridges fired by the garand, and counted them one more time. He slept poorly. Not because he feared the enemy. Because he feared being wrong. If he failed, men would die the next day. If he succeeded, he would still have to survive the consequences. A lone shooter breaking doctrine attracted attention. Attention in the jungle was fatal. George knew that once he fired the first shot, he would no longer be solving the battalion's problem. He would become one. By dawn, he moved alone into the ruins of a captured bunker overlooking the coconut groves west of Point Cruz. No one followed him. No one watched his back. The battalion did not need a hero. It needed results. As he settled into position, George understood the truth no one else wanted to say out loud. If this worked, it would expose a flaw not in the jungle, not in the enemy, but in the system that had laughed at the rifle in his hands. And if it did not work, the jungle would erase him quietly, the way it erased everyone else. Either way, there would be no witnesses. The rifle John George carried was not designed for war. It was designed for control. The Winchester Model 70 was a bolt-action rifle built around precision, not speed. 5 rounds in the magazine. 1 shot at a time. Every movement deliberate. Every trigger pull final. In a firefight, that was a liability. In the jungle, it changed the equation. The scope mounted on top was equally unimpressive by military standards. 2.5 power magnification. Barely enough to bring distant shapes closer. Not enough to dominate a wide field of view. But it offered something the naked eye could not: separation. In the jungle, everything moved. Leaves shifted. Insects vibrated branches. Light fractured through layers of canopy. The human eye was overwhelmed. The scope did not eliminate chaos. It slowed it down. It forced the observer to search methodically, left to right, top to bottom, instead of reacting to noise and instinct. That mattered more than firepower. Japanese snipers exploited a blind spot American doctrine never addressed. They did not rely on distance. They relied on verticality. Banyan trees were perfect hides. Thick trunks. Dense foliage. Multiple branches intersecting at different angles. A sniper positioned 80 or 90 feet up could see movement on trails, supply routes, and water points while remaining completely invisible from below. American patrols were trained to scan forward. Occasionally to the flanks. Rarely upward. The jungle canopy was assumed to be background, not threat. That assumption killed men. Japanese snipers also understood patience. They did not trade shots. They fired once, relocated, and waited hours or days for the next opportunity. Many worked in pairs. 1 shooter. 1 observer. The observer's job was not to kill targets. It was to kill anyone who tried to kill the shooter. This was where the jungle punished speed. A rapid-firing rifle encouraged follow-up shots. Follow-up shots meant movement. Movement meant sound. Sound echoed unpredictably through dense vegetation, revealing direction even when the shooter could not be seen. The jungle magnified mistakes. The bolt-action rifle did the opposite. It enforced discipline. After every shot, the shooter had to cycle the bolt, reacquire the target, and confirm it was safe to fire again. That pause was not a weakness. It was a filter. It prevented panic. It prevented chasing shadows. George understood this instinctively. He also understood what the rifle could not do. 5 rounds meant no margin for error. If he fired unnecessarily, he would run dry at the worst possible moment. Cycling the bolt broke his sight picture. If the enemy moved after the shot, he might never find them again. This forced him to wait. Waiting was the jungle's currency. George's position selection mattered as much as the rifle. He chose ruins of a captured bunker overlooking the coconut groves west of Point Cruz. The bunker offered cover and elevation. More importantly, it offered predictability. Japanese snipers expected American movement along trails and open ground. They did not expect a lone shooter to occupy a static position and stay there for hours. That expectation gap was another blind spot. The scope allowed George to detect movement without exposing himself. Not full silhouettes. Not faces. Just violations of pattern. A branch where none should move. A shift without wind. A shape that did not belong. This was not marksmanship in the traditional sense. It was pattern recognition under pressure. Every Japanese sniper George killed made the jungle more dangerous. The first kill went unanswered. The second forced the enemy to react. By the third, they were searching for him. By the fifth, they were adapting. That adaptation revealed another blind spot. Japanese snipers relied on concealment and patience, but they assumed the enemy would respond predictably. They expected counter-snipers to mirror their tactics, climb trees, seek elevation, hunt from above. George did not. He stayed grounded. He let the rifle do the work of elevation through optics. That kept his silhouette low. It reduced exposure. It made his firing position harder to triangulate. When the Japanese responded with mortars, they were reacting to sound and assumption, not confirmed observation. The jungle punished that assumption. When mortars began walking toward his bunker, George did not argue with the math. He moved fast. Not because doctrine said so, but because survival demanded it. The rifle was light enough to run with. Heavy enough to stabilize shots from improvised positions. It did not demand perfect conditions. It demanded understanding. As the duel escalated, the jungle became a second opponent. Rain masked movement. Mud erased tracks and created new ones. Waterlogged craters became concealment. Light angles changed visibility by the minute, turning perfect hides into silhouettes. George adapted because the rifle allowed him to adapt. It did not overwhelm him with options. It constrained him into making correct decisions or none at all. This was the point doctrine missed. The jungle did not reward aggression. It rewarded restraint. It did not reward volume of fire. It rewarded the first correct shot. And it punished anyone who believed speed could replace understanding. By the time the Japanese realized they were being hunted by a single shooter who did not behave like one, the balance had already shifted. Every sniper killed reduced their freedom to wait. Every hour without success increased their urgency. Urgency created movement. Movement created exposure. The rifle did not win the fight by itself. It enforced a way of thinking the jungle demanded and doctrine ignored. And once George pulled the trigger the first time, there was no returning to the rules everyone else was following. The first kill changed nothing. Not immediately. The jungle did not go quiet. Birds kept screaming. Insects kept crawling. The canopy absorbed the sound of the rifle as if it had never happened. For a brief moment, it was possible to believe that nothing had shifted. That belief was a trap. John George understood what the first shot meant. Somewhere in the trees, a second Japanese sniper was already processing the sound. Not where it came from exactly, but what it represented. A deviation. A break in the pattern. Someone was hunting. Doctrine offered a simple answer to that realization: relocate, report, bring more men. George did none of those things. He stayed. Staying violated every safe instinct an infantry officer was trained to follow. A single shooter who revealed his position was expected to move immediately or die. Counterfire did not require accuracy. It required probability. Mortars, machine guns, blind suppressive fire. The jungle amplified all of it. George stayed because moving created its own signature. Footsteps in mud. Branches snapping. Tracks that told a story he could not erase. Relocation meant surrendering observation and betting that the enemy would not notice the change. Staying meant accepting that the jungle would soon start looking back. When the second sniper revealed himself, George fired again. A second body fell. 2 shots. 2 kills. No applause. No confirmation from anyone else. Just the weight of the rifle and the knowledge that the enemy would not make the same mistake twice. By the third kill, George crossed a line he could not uncross. The Japanese response came not as rifle fire, but as mathematics. Mortars began to walk toward his position. Not accurately. Not precisely. But closer with every adjustment. Someone was listening. Someone was calculating. George did not wait to see if the third salvo would land on him. He ran. This was the first moment where the decision to operate alone revealed its true cost. There was no one to cover his movement. No one to draw fire. No one to mislead the enemy. Every step he took was a gamble with exposure. He abandoned the bunker, the one position the enemy had already committed resources to destroying, and vanished into the trees. From that moment on, the mission stopped being about killing snipers. It became about surviving the attention of men who now knew exactly what they were dealing with. George understood that every additional shot narrowed the gap between hunter and hunted. The Japanese adapted quickly. They stopped moving during daylight. They used rain to mask movement. They set bait positions. They coordinated fire and maneuver, not to kill targets, but to flush him into the open. Each adaptation forced George to make decisions that doctrine had never prepared him for. He began to change positions preemptively. Not after firing. Before the enemy reacted. He chose ground-level hides. Water-filled craters. Fallen trees. Places no one wanted to stay in for long. Places that smelled, soaked, and numbed the body. The rifle made these decisions possible. It was compact enough to move with. Simple enough to function when wet. Familiar enough that he trusted it even when conditions were degrading. By the end of the first day, George was no longer executing a plan. He was improvising inside a narrowing margin of survival. The battalion did not see this. To them, he was either succeeding or failing. Numbers mattered. Bodies mattered. The process did not. If he was killed, the explanation would be simple. Lone officer. Overconfident. Poor judgment. George knew that if he stopped now, the snipers would return. The jungle would reset. Men would die again in small, quiet ways. If he continued, the enemy would focus everything on him. There was no version of this where he walked away clean. That night, as he cleaned his rifle and counted remaining ammunition, George faced the reality doctrine avoided. Once you challenge an enemy who knows how to wait, the only way out is to make them react faster than they want to. Speed was not his advantage. Pressure was. At dawn, he returned to the grove. Not because it was safe. Because there was no other way to finish what he had started. Dawn on January 23 did not bring clarity. It brought rain. Heavy tropical rain hammered the jungle canopy, turning the ground into mud and reducing visibility to little more than shapes and sound. From George's position, the banyan trees dissolved into gray silhouettes. Even with optics, there was nothing to see. For nearly an hour, the jungle hid everything. George stayed still. Movement during rain was tempting. The noise covered footsteps. Tracks blurred quickly. The Japanese knew this. If they were smart, they would already be climbing. When the rain finally slowed at 8:15, George did not rush. He waited until the light returned enough to separate branches from bodies. At 8:45, the jungle became readable again. At 9:12, he found the first sniper of the day. The man had climbed during the rain, using sound and concealment exactly as doctrine dictated. He was positioned farther out than the previous day, nearly 300 yards away. Longer range. Smaller margin for error. The Japanese were adjusting. George adjusted too. He compensated for distance, controlled his breathing, and fired. The body fell cleanly through the branches. 6. The number mattered less than the response. At 9:57, the jungle answered with explosions. Japanese mortars began landing short of his position, walking closer with every correction. Someone had triangulated his location using sound, flash, or simple probability. The first rounds were warnings. The third would be lethal. George ran. He abandoned the bunker seconds before it vanished in dirt and shrapnel. The explosion confirmed what he already knew: the enemy had shifted from hunting passively to eliminating him directly. He relocated north, using a fallen tree as cover. It was not a perfect position. It did not need to be. It gave him observation and concealment. That was enough. By midday, the Japanese sent more snipers. This was the turning point where George still held the advantage. The enemy was reacting, not predicting. They were sending individual shooters, relying on skill and concealment rather than coordinated maneuver. George punished that mistake. At 14:23, he killed the 7th sniper. At 15:41, the 8th. One of them had climbed nearly 94 feet into a banyan tree. Excellent concealment. But height came with a cost. As the sun angle shifted, the sniper's silhouette betrayed him against the sky. The jungle gave, and the jungle took away. By 1700 hours, George had been in position for 9 hours. He withdrew before darkness made identification impossible. That choice mattered. Staying would have felt aggressive. It would also have been reckless. The jungle favored the night. He did not. Back at headquarters, Captain Morris did not mock him. Morris wanted numbers. 8 confirmed kills. 12 rounds fired. 4 misses. The math was impossible to ignore. Morris ordered him back at dawn. That night, George cleaned his rifle and did the math himself. 11 Japanese snipers. 8 dead. 3 remaining. The survivors would not behave like the others. They had watched friends die. They had learned his patterns. By January 24th, the hunt became symmetrical. Rain returned before dawn. George used it to move, selecting a position the enemy would not expect. Not the bunker. Not the fallen tree. He chose a cluster of rocks previously used as a machine gun nest. Elevated. Overlooked. Predictable only to someone who understood American habits. When visibility improved at 7:43, George began scanning. At 8:17, he found sniper number 9. The position was wrong. The Japanese soldier had chosen a palm tree, low elevation, heavy concealment. The fronds hid him perfectly from ground-level observers. George could see him only because he was elevated on the rocks. The shot was there. George did not take it. The position was too easy. He expanded his search. 11 minutes passed. That was an eternity in sniper work. At 8:28, he found the real threat. A banyan tree 80 yards away. 91 feet up. Perfect concealment. Clear line of sight to George's previous position. Bait. George used it against them. He killed the decoy. Then the real sniper when movement betrayed him. 9 and 10 fell within seconds of each other. The jungle answered with machine gun fire, raking the rocks George had occupied moments earlier. He relocated again, then again, using craters, mud, water, and time. Now only one remained. The final sniper was different. He did not climb. He did not rush. He did not reveal himself. He moved on the ground, using vegetation, patience, and the assumption that George would behave predictably. George realized it too late. The sniper was not watching the trees. He was hunting George. By the time George identified the threat, the distance had closed to less than 40 yards. The engagement had compressed from long-range precision to close-range nerve. This was the last moment where George still controlled the pace. What came next would strip that control away. The jungle did not rush the end. It tightened it. By the time John George understood that the last Japanese sniper was on the ground, the distance between hunter and hunted had collapsed to a scale doctrine never prepared him for. 30 yards. Then 25. Then less. The rifle that had given him control at long range now imposed limits. The crater he had chosen for concealment was filling with rainwater. Mud pressed into his uniform. The rim blocked his angle. To fire, he would have to rise. Rising meant exposure. George stayed submerged, the rifle held vertical to keep water from the barrel. His breathing slowed until it barely disturbed the surface. Every instinct screamed to act, to force the moment. He resisted. At 9:52, the Japanese sniper stopped moving. The man was good. He did not rush. He studied the rocks George had abandoned earlier, searching for the smallest sign of life. He believed George had moved east. He was wrong, but not by much. At 9:58, the sniper began moving again, crawling closer, following the most likely escape route. George recognized the tactic immediately. The man had watched the machine gun fire rake the rocks. He had seen George flee. He was reconstructing the hunt from fragments. At 10:03, the sniper reached the rocks. 38 yards from George's actual position. The shot was easy. Center mass. No scope needed. George did not take it. Something was wrong. No experienced sniper stayed exposed. Not without coverage. Not after watching 10 others die. This was bait. George widened his awareness and found the truth 6 seconds later. Another Japanese soldier, 70 yards northwest, concealed behind a fallen tree. Rifle trained on the drainage ditch where George should have been. 2 men. George could not kill both before they reacted. The bolt-action rifle enforced that reality. 1 shot. A pause. Enough time for return fire. He chose patience. George lowered himself deeper into the crater until only his eyes broke the surface. The water was cold. Mud pressed against his chest. He waited while seconds stretched into minutes. At 10:13, the soldier at the rock stood and signaled. They began a sweep. They passed George's position without seeing him. That was the moment. George rose from the water, brought the rifle to his shoulder, and fired. The first soldier dropped. George cycled the bolt and fired again. The second fell mid-turn. 11. The jungle did not pause to acknowledge the number. Voices followed almost immediately. Not 1. Not 2. Multiple. Infantry. A recovery team or patrol responding to the dead. George dropped back into the crater as branches cracked and equipment rattled closer. He stayed submerged, counting steps. At 10:28, the voices changed direction. They were coming toward him. They had found his tracks. George had 5 rounds left. No support. No escape route that did not expose him. He considered hiding and letting them pass. The jungle did not give that option. At 10:31, a Japanese soldier appeared at the crater rim. Their eyes met. George fired from the water. The man fell backward. George cycled the bolt, rose, and fired twice more at shapes forming at the edge. 2 more bodies dropped. Shouting erupted. Rifle fire snapped through the trees. Bullets struck dirt and stone. George climbed out of the crater on the far side and ran. He moved under fire, using sound and chaos as cover. He dropped behind a fallen tree, fired again, then again. 1 soldier fell. Another dove for cover. The voices multiplied. They were flanking. George understood the math instantly. A bolt-action rifle could not win a sustained firefight against multiple soldiers with semi-automatic weapons. Staying meant being surrounded. He broke contact. George ran north through undergrowth, branches tearing at his uniform, vines catching his boots. Rifle fire followed, inaccurate but persistent. He ran until his lungs burned, then dove into another crater. Silence returned slowly. At 10:47, he moved again, this time carefully, staying low, using terrain instead of speed. He reached the American perimeter at 11:13. The hunt was over. At headquarters, George reported 11 snipers killed over 4 days. 12 rounds fired at them. 11 hits. Then the firefight. 3 more kills. 5 rounds expended. He had 2 rounds left. No one argued doctrine anymore. What remained was the cost. The jungle had taken its share of attention, energy, and margin for error. George had survived because he adapted faster than the enemy and because the rifle in his hands forced him to think instead of react. There was no victory celebration. No sense of triumph. Only the knowledge that one wrong decision, one rushed shot, one moment of impatience would have ended differently. The jungle did not care who was right. It only punished who was wrong. The Point Cruz groves went quiet after January 24. Not silent. The jungle was never silent. But the pattern changed. No more single shots from unseen angles. No more bodies found on trails or beside water points. The threat that had killed 14 men in 72 hours simply stopped. At battalion headquarters, there was no ceremony. No announcement. No acknowledgement that doctrine had been bypassed rather than applied. Captain Morris asked for numbers. George gave them. 11 snipers killed. 12 rounds fired at them. 11 hits. That was enough. Within days, George was ordered to do something the army had never formally asked anyone to do before. Train others to fight the jungle the way he had. Rifles with optics were gathered. Men who could already shoot were identified. A sniper section was assembled without a name, without a doctrine, without precedent. It worked. In less than 2 weeks, the new teams eliminated dozens of remaining Japanese soldiers operating west of the Matanico River. Casualties dropped. Patrols moved again. The jungle did not become safer, but it became readable. The rifle John George carried never became standard issue. It did not need to. The lesson was not about a specific weapon. It was about constraint. About how a tool that forced patience could outperform one that rewarded speed in the wrong environment. George carried that lesson with him beyond Guadalcanal. In Burma, the rifle was lighter, modified, used sparingly. Jungle warfare there favored ambushes at close range, not long shots. The rifle was no longer central. It was situational. George understood that too. Tools mattered only when matched correctly to reality. After the war, the army formalized sniper training. Optics became accepted. Precision regained legitimacy alongside volume of fire. The jungle had forced the institution to acknowledge something it preferred to ignore. George never spoke publicly about Point Cruz. He did not tell stories. He wrote instead. Clinical. Technical. No heroism. No drama. Just what worked and what failed when doctrine met terrain and lost. The rifle followed him home. It sat in a case. It gathered no myths. Years later, it ended up behind glass in a museum. Most people walked past it without stopping. It looked like a hunting rifle. Old. Unremarkable. That was the point. In January 1943, a battalion faced a problem it could not solve by the rules it trusted. A man ignored those rules, not to prove a theory, but to stop men from dying. The jungle did not care why he succeeded. It only responded to what he did. The rifle did not change the war. But for 4 days in a place no one remembers, it forced an army to admit that sometimes, the correct answer is the one everyone laughs at first.